Hello interwebs and welcome to my channel. So for today's video, I wanted to do a kind of a deeper dive into a subject that has become a much bigger issue within the transgender community recently, and that's the issue of, does dysphoria make you transgender? Or is gender dysphoria or body dysphoria required to be transgender? This has been like a very hot topic within the transgender community, as I alluded to, because there is a large section of the transgender community, and particularly a lot of transgender YouTubers that I watch, who I look up to and like, they say that dysphoria is a requirement for being transgender, that you cannot be transgender if you don't have dysphoria, at least at some point in your life. So I didn't actually script out this video like I normally do. Normally I'd sit down, write a full-fledged script, and have like all these points that I wanted to make. But the reason that I didn't do that for this video is, for the scripted videos, I'm tending to make those from sort of an authoritative point of view. Like, this is generally what the transgender community has come up with or thought about or has to say on this subject matter. But for this particular topic, this is a topic that is going on within the transgender community. And I don't really want to come out and say that I have the definitive authoritative stance on this. I have a very strong stance in that I don't believe dysphoria is required for being transgender, and I'll get into why I think that in a minute. I want to have this as a discussion within the transgender and then larger LGBT community as well, to a degree. I think this is very much a conversation that should be had within the transgender community first and then maybe opened up. But, you know, we live in a world where everyone's going to comment on everything, from the Trump administration to myself. You know, people are going to join in anyways, and have joined in. So I'm going to quick, for this video, give a general idea of the difference between what I see as transgender and gender dysphoria, and then jump into two things that I think need to be discussed in this topic of whether or not dysphoria is required for being transgender. The first is the sort of clinical gender theory and identity politics definition that I sort of subscribe to. And then I also want to talk about this from an emotional standpoint, because being transgender has an emotional toll on people, and some more than others. And I don't want to sort of exclude that sort of emotional side of things just by saying, like, here's the clinical, theory definition of everything, and therefore we need to just have that as a definitive answer. Being transgender, the definition of that is basically saying that one does not identify with their gender that they are assigned at birth. So, when you're, born with male genitalia, you're assigned the gender of boy, and then if you're transgender, you'll be like, no, I'm a girl, or no, I'm non-binary, or no, I'm another gender altogether. And so you will want to transition or take some steps to sort of align yourself with that gender. And actually, maybe you don't take any steps at all, and that's kind of part of this dysphoria problem. Cisgender is sort of, I hate saying the opposite, because I hate framing trans and cis as sort of opposites. We're both human, just with different experience. But cis is different in the sense that, cisgender is when you identify with the gender that you correspond with at birth. Now, typically, what we tend to understand as the transgender experience is that you understand that you identify with a different gender through gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is feeling a distress with some part of your body or how people treat you. There's body dysphoria, which is just specifically your body. There's gender dysphoria, which is just can be body dysphoria, or how people treat you. So basically you're like, oh, I don't like it when I'm not treated like a girl, or I don't like having to wear boys' clothes, or I don't like being talked about with a boy's pronoun, and I want to shift to have a girl's pronoun, wear girl's clothes, things like that, because those eliminate that dysphoria. And by eliminating gender dysphoria, then you sort of complete your transition and get rid of the gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is a mental illness because it is hampering your life. Mental illness generally is some sort of distress that causes problems with you living your day-to-day life. And gender dysphoria can definitely do that. And that can cause a lot of day-to-day problems to the point where you can't live your life. Or it can be just simply innocuous and you're just like, this really bothers me, it's something I think about a lot, but I can still go about my day. And a lot of transgender people can, but it does cause a lot of depression, emotional distress, things like that. And that's what happened with me personally. The question comes then, is that dysphoria required to be transgender? Now, I would say no in terms of a clinical definition, because there are actually other ways that people can identify with being transgender. So what if, wearing boys' clothing doesn't cause you any distress? Like, let's say you identify as a woman, you were born as a man, or you were assigned the gender of man at birth, but you don't have any problem wearing men's clothing, but you do love wearing dresses. And you find that to feel amazing. You feel euphoric when you wear dresses. That would be euphoria, because wearing men's clothing doesn't necessarily cause you any qualms or issues, but it makes you happier wearing women's clothing. Now, some would argue that, oh, euphoria is just like a different form of dysphoria, but I would categorize it as different, because we can experience levels of happiness while still being baseline neutral or okay with our lives. Someone could want to identify as a woman because it makes them happier, but doesn't necessarily cause them distress. And gender dysphoria is not a mental illness in their case. It's just like, I prefer to be a woman, and I prefer to wear women's clothing, or be treated like a woman, or be viewed as a woman, or use women's pronouns, any of those sort of things that, you tend to ascribe to different gender expressions. But there is also another way to exist, and that's people who don't really have any euphoric feelings or dysphoric feelings, but they just identify with another gender. Sometimes for political reasons, sometimes just because it's like, I just feel like this gender, and I don't feel really happy about it or really sad about it when I'm another gender, but it's just, something I want to exist. I have some friends who do this, who are just like, I was identified as a man at birth, but I don't really like how gender works in our society and find gender oppressive and all these things, and I prefer to identify as non-binary to sort of take myself out of this sort of binary gender world that we live in. And then sort of taking that and having the non-binary nature sort of be a political act or a reaction against society, but don't necessarily have any sort of mental illness. The other group of people in that sort of like, oh, don't really have dysphoria at all space are just people who just like, I identify with this specific gender. I identify as non-binary, I identify as genderqueer. It's not really a political reason, it's just sort of like, I identify this way, but I don't really have any stress. So I just want to kind of, before I get into the emotional side of things, I kind of want to just examine this clinical definition. So transgender is just identifying with a gender that is not your own. And gender dysphoria is the mental illness that can cause people to recognize that they are transgender, but is a sort of separate thing. Is that dysphoria necessary to recognizing that you're trans? I would argue no, because they are separate things. I mean, even take my case. Yes, I suffered from gender dysphoria, and I had to undergo hormones, a name change, therapy, and gender confirmation surgery to make myself mentally and physically match what was in my head to eliminate my gender dysphoria. But today, just existing and going about my life, I have little to no gender dysphoria. It may pop up here and there, especially if people like use a male pronoun with me. It sort of like hits me for a second. It's not really super distressing, but it does knock me back for a minute. But I have little to no gender dysphoria on my day-to-day life, but I'm still transgender. Every second of every day, I am transgender, but I do not have gender dysphoria. So I think the fact that I can sort of separate these two things, I think, means that we can sort of separate dysphoria from being trans. That they can be two separate things that can coexist in a person, but they can be separate, distinct things and are not required for them. They tend to be related very often, but are not required. Now, I kind of want to get into the sort of emotional side of things. Not everyone's transgender experience is good. In fact, for a lot of people, being transgender is honestly a very painful experience. And definitely coming out as transgender and experiencing gender dysphoria and things like that are not fun. I went through a lot of depression, and I've talked about wanting to commit suicide on a previous video that I did, and that sucks. And I understand why people sort of want to say like, oh, that validated my transgender identity. That like going through that meant something, and it said that I was trans, and suffering all these things were important to being transgender. The problem with that is it makes us gatekeepers on what is trans and what is not. And I don't think that any of us have the right to do that, to say that you have to experience a certain level of pain to be able to qualify for this identity. Because I am someone who is very much of the mind that we cannot define our self-identity by the pain we feel or the oppression that we feel. We cannot define ourselves as trans by saying, oh, you experience this much level of pain and then you're trans, you use this much level of dysphoria, or you experience this much level of oppression from people and that makes you trans. That's what TERFs do. And I'm not saying transgender people are TERFs, but I think this is a very apt metaphor. When you look at TERFs, who are trans exclusionary radical feminists who say that trans women are not women and that they are men trying to pretend to be women. TERFs tend to say that women are socialized and are oppressed by men since birth. And since trans women, men who want to become women, in their minds, since they have not experienced that level of oppression, can never be a woman. They can never understand what it means to be a woman. They can never understand what it means to be socialized as a woman. They cannot understand what it means to be oppressed as a woman in certain ways, such as, not having access to abortions or birth control or women's health care. That because we don't face, as trans people, we don't face those specific issues, then we cannot be women. Because they define their womanhood by the oppression that they face. And as terrible as TERFs are, and as much as I really hate what they do to the trans community, it is also a very pitiable thing. That all they can understand of their womanhood is the pain that they feel. Not to be condescending, but I do feel an element of pity in that's all you see your womanhood as being. Because I see womanhood as being a really beautiful thing in many ways. And there are some terrible aspects to it, but again, defined by oppression and pain. And that's why, I as someone am always trying to argue that we need to talk about being trans in a positive light, like the benefits, the joys of being trans. Like I think being transgender is a beautiful thing. From the community it gives you to this specific perspective that being trans gives you on the world. Things being malleable and things being open to interpretation and sort of seeing past a binary view of things and being able to move across boundaries and sort of opening yourselves. That mindset, a lot of that mindset comes from me being trans. And every definition of being transgender can be different for different people, and that's okay, because it's a broad thing. We're all human. And then there's different parts of being human. The transgender community can all be transgender and have different aspects of a trans experience. But it doesn't make anyone more or less trans, because how can you quantify what it means to be transgender? What level is there to being trans? I don't like a linear spectrum model. I don't like man here, woman here, and then, trans people sort of slide along it at some point, and that's gender. And if that works for you, that's totally cool. But it tends to put this gauge on how trans you are. It's like if you're a man here and a woman here, and you go I identify here on the spectrum, 75% man and 25% woman. It's like, okay, am I 75% trans then? No, you're just trans. We shouldn't talk about cisgender people as a one quantifiable group and transgender people as a quantifiable group, but talk about where we are cis or trans in our life. I would identify in the trans community, but there are certain things about my identity that I still identify with how I was treated since birth. I sometimes wear men's shirts, I sometimes wear men's styling in my hair, but that's something I could have done since birth. So when I do that, am I less trans? I would just say that, I am who I am, and maybe that's sort of a cisgender aspect of myself, or a cis aspect of myself, something I identify with that I had since birth, and then other aspects of myself are trans. I don't think we can say that dysphoria is a qualifier for being trans. You do not need to have dysphoria for being trans. I understand completely where that mindset comes from, and that's why I'm doing this as a conversation starter. As much as I talk about how I want transgender to be talked about in a very positive aspect, and being transgender is great, that is not the case for everybody. There are some people out there who their experience of being transgender is horrible in terms of their own sort of gender dysphoria going on in their head. It's painful in terms of how people treat them, or the politics behind being transgender of we are, in certain ways, second-class citizens in the United States of America and in other countries as well. And that is awful and terrible. But I think that we cannot and should not fall into the trap of defining ourselves solely by oppression and pain. We need to define ourselves as who we are at our core. Because if we define transgender as simply oppression or pain, when I say I am transgender, that means that internally inside of me there is oppression and pain. And that's all there ever can be, because I am trans. I would rather define being transgender as something positive or neutral and say that that's who I am inside. And that all these things, the oppression and the pain that I feel, are external and temporary, or can be temporary, or can be treated. I think that's really, really important. Just as we say being a man can be a positive thing, but there are toxic elements of being a man, and just as we can say being a woman is a positive thing, but there are certain negatives to being a woman, so too should we say that being trans is a positive thing, just as being cis is a positive thing. It's just different forms of living as a human being. And the oppression and pain that we feel for these different identities or toxicity or things like that are problems with how we as a society have looked at being human. And that those things are quantifiable and fixable and treatable. Because that's how we make a better world. But being human is neither good nor bad, it just is. And I think that's really important to talk about within our community. What do you think about this? Is dysphoria required for being transgender? Do you agree with my ideas on how we should define being transgender? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please leave a comment. If you like my content, please give a subscribe. Click the bell to be notified of all my new videos. I release new videos every other Friday right here on YouTube. And you can follow me at JesseGender on all of the Facebook and Twitter and other social media stuff. So thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you again on my next video.